Value of sustainability. Well, it's an interesting question because what does people mean by sustainability? Because we've all got our own definitions. What do people mean by value? First of all, I'm going to look at energy efficiency and BRE's actual experience in it. And we've been around a long time. I haven't quite been here 40 years, though it feels like it sometimes. I've been around about 25 years in this field. And I work abroad a lot and with governments a lot, actually making the case for energy efficiency or reduction and the sustainability case, both in terms of minimum energy performance standards for buildings and the EPC's energy performance certification, the schemes behind that, the legislation, etc. At the moment, I'm working in the Balkans, those countries actually rolling it out and helping their governments to do this kind of thing at a national level, but also with a big case study in Hungary where we're working on a eco-shopping project, which is a €4 million refurbishment of a shopping mall, because they don't want to bring their shopping, leave their inner cities actually in degradation, and they don't want to go to the out of town retail outlets we've gone to. They want to put it back into the inner city and then provide value for that, which is an interesting approach and one that we could actually learn from, I think. How we do certification and training. But what is sustainability? Well, you can go to the meeting the needs of the present and the future. Yeah, we should be looking at the future, but I'm a bit more hard-nosed than that because we should be looking at business drivers. And I'm going to concentrate on energy because really, in reality, that's the biggest prize. And how do we deal with it and how do we build the business case up? Because the UK spends £2.4 billion on energy per annum. And unfortunately, we waste 21% of that. Now, that's not all recoverable, but about 15% is. And you can break that down into 5% being recoverable with no-cost measures and the 5% with low cost. And then someone along the line, you've got to put some investment in and you can retain the next 5% as well. In terms of the built environment, why is that important? Well, if we look at the life cycle of a building, from cradle to grave and resurrection, or whatever you want to phrase it, energy is 40% of life costs. And that's very important, especially up front when you're designing it, but also when you're operating it, it's 50% the running costs. That is a big expenditure and one that should be managed properly and also should be in terms of recovery as well, especially in the long-term asset management. So we need to manage it effectively. Now, a few other numbers, and I brought this because we are the 40% symposium, that's where the number comes from, because the built environment is 45% of UK emissions. And 18% of that, or 18 to 20%, is from non-domestic building stock. The drivers, well, we have security supply, and I was at an interesting seminar with the National Grid and a workshop about a month ago, where the headroom in peak supply in London is only 2% now of capacity. So we have a major problem on the horizon already with security supply, and the overall capacity for London, even on average capacity, is reached 90%. So in the near future, there are going to be major security supply issues. And there are several ways of dealing with that. There's also rising costs. We're lucky at the moment we've got a bit of hiatus where things have levelled out, even some reduction. But there's only so long before the OPEC will stop actually trying to bust the Russians. And also the Iraqis and the Iranis are not going to shove cheap dollars for oil prices. So the predictions are that, again, next year it will start going up again. Here's the important thing, is wastage, good management practice. It's been shown that organisations actually do good resource management, save costs, and as a result have a quality of stock and productivity in their staff. So there are the knock-on benefits, and I'll talk about those later. There's green credentials or branding, and that's about trust with your supply chain and also with your employees. And finally, legislation, and I was speaking to Rupert last week, Lord Rensdale, and he's going to talk about that this afternoon. He's doing another briefing because the Treasury currently have a major review of business legislation, especially in the energy field, and also our CEO is doing a major review of that in the built environment. The aim is to actually reduce legislation, though I believe it when I see it, and as John said, it seems to be more of it. And also the Treasury never give you anything back, so I should very much doubt whether the taxation will actually be reduced either. Now, energy efficiency has been around a long time, and really it's getting a kind of muddy name. So I want to try and go to reduction instead. This is really about reducing your cost base and producing a better asset. Because you want to save costs, and there is the overall trend of 10% year-on-year increases. You have that wastage, which is an opportunity rather than actual negative, because that is what you're aiming to actually reduce. You need to comply with legislation, and there are those at the moment, but we'll see what happens out of the Treasury review in the next few months. Though as a minimum, they're going to join those together, which will still mean there will be reduction targets and there will be taxation alongside that. And all importantly is to manage business risk. This is what it really is about. And if you do nothing, well, that's a valid way of doing it as long as you understand what the risks of the business are and what you're letting yourself in for. And there's also these security supply issues, which are very much on the immediate horizon. So for reducing the business case, there's options to manage risk, do nothing, but you need to know what the consequences, and that means making an educated decision. You need to understand what the financial metrics are, and that depends on what marketplace you is, and they're all different. And they're all organisation specific. And you need to know the rules of the game when you're actually going into making this business case. What is acceptable to organisations? What they're trying to achieve in the long term in terms of their business strategy and mission. And I'm always the thing about kissing it, keeping it short and simple, because a lot of business cases, especially from the technical point of view, are like reading War and Peace. And they lose the reader in the first page, and you just lost your sell before you start. And you need to concentrate on what the benefits are. And when you present options, it shouldn't be just the one you want, it should be the viable options to whoever is the recipient and the reasons for them. So managing risk. You've got the prices we mentioned earlier. A real important one, the loss of essential services due to security supply issues, because if you lose things, that affects productivity, knock on the building effect, etc. Increasing downtime if failure plant is not repaired properly. The investment portfolio is not there and you're not maintaining it. Again, that can be switched around to an opportunity, because if you deal with that issue, you reduce your maintenance costs. And then reduce productivity. Occupiers or end users want a reasonable working environment because they have to work within that environment and actually have to produce something, and that's all important. And then again, increase maintenance as well. So what happens if you do nothing? Well, that's okay, as long as you consider the risks and the likely outcomes if nothing happens. And again, though, you need good data, and we heard that earlier. Lord Kelvin's approach is that you need to have data to manage, but that's fine, but also you need to investigate as well. You need to discover the reasons for the poor performance before you can act on it. And that's when auditing's a bad phrase. I mean, it's more like a review, but you need to put that data together in a form which is digestible and means something. And software is not always the right way, because you need to identify the gaps in that data, and the organisation needs to map themselves to understand where they are before they can actually put in recommendations to where they're going to go to. And that's identifying what needs they have out of their buildings in terms of what they're producing as a business itself. And is it organisation specific? But it's a snapshot of where they are, baselining themselves for investment. And then you can identify the opportunities for energy saving or reduction and for further investment. That data collection has got to be in a meaningful way in the long term, so you can actually gather it and then add to it, so it provides you to actually make an informed decision. And that's what this is about, informed decision making. And you need to use the appropriate standards. Anyone who's followed the ESOS, I was going to say saga, but it really is a saga. Well, I think only the 16,000 organisations are supposed to have it done. About 500 are now registered. So the lead time will go out again. Well, the appropriate standards there for measuring buildings aren't really in line with Europe, so there could be the option where it's called non-compliant with the EU directive that's binding it. So they don't even quote that standard in there. Or EN's got, that standard's got 4 parts, which now make ISO 50002 up, the review standard for the energy management standard. So it's using the right standards to get the right information. Right, another acronym, building the performance gap. Now, I'm as guilty as anyone because I coined this phrase about 10 years ago. And really, it's what understanding, but when some building is designed, what's the difference between predicted and actual building use? And unfortunately, I say rarely perform as well as designers predicted. I would say they never perform as well as the designers predicted because you've got real human beings occupying that building and they do things you cannot predict. However, you can get a bit closer than what you can at the moment. Now, I used to say it's about double what was expected. However, a recent Innovate UK report of about 250 buildings shows it can be up to 450% difference. Yeah? So if you're passing a building on to the actual end user, that can be a really nasty shock when they have to pay the bills. So how can we make that better? That has now become the performance gap, where their illusions are shattered and when they take over the building and it's not actually doing what they've predicted. Now that can be due to a lot of things, and the problem mostly is reliance here on regulatory instruments or gaps like EBCs and DECs because they use standardised, normalised conditions of use such as set points, occupancy, etc. And the reason for that is they've got to be comparable for a regulatory basis. But they don't actually make very good tools when you're actually looking at a real building in use. So why bridge this gap? Well, we've got to assess what savings there are and optimise it in terms of cost reduction. We talked about upgrade and obsolescence. And hopefully this will not disappear in 2018 with the E. I'm not quite sure what the review is going to say, but there is always a possibility that the current government might actually remove this because the low carbon and zero carbon buildings commitments seem to have disappeared off the agenda already, as it now being aspirations rather than targets. However, how that fits into European legislation is another matter, and I don't think that'll be part of Mr Cameron's negotiation points, but you never know. And to implement ESOS, because my fear is ESOS is going to go the same way as the audits from the Environmental and Energy Helpline 10 years ago and the ones from the Carbon Trust where they make very expensive bookmarks or doorstops and gather dust, rather than actually a useful way of actually providing information to what you do next. Right, so I said EPCs are useful, but they're undone on normalised conditions. So how do you unlock that normality? Well, you can actually use the Green Deal tool. I'm sorry for using that phrase, but I know it's a flawed policy mechanism. However, the tools themselves are actually quite useful because it unlocks the standardised assumptions on a building-by-building basis. So you can use your EPC and the modelling file behind it and unlock, in reality, to put real occupancy in there and real standardised assumptions, real design temperatures. But also, and that gives you a real snapshot of how that building is really performing because you can put operational data in there as well. And also, you can use it for scenario running. Now, it gives you a first step there about how effective a measure could be. And you can put real fuel prices in there, and real fuel usage and real meter readings from the utility meters, and actually see how much that building operates and costs to operate. Then you can normalise that and work out savings. So it gives you a first idea of what actually going to work in practice. So going left to right, you can take as EPC, you can tailor it to the real building. Sorry, John. There you go. You can put management criteria and see how well the building is managed. You can normalise it and put your real data in, and then you can do scenario modelling to see what the effect of real measures is. So it's a reasonably powerful tool. It is only a first snapshot, and you would use it then to target the buildings within your portfolio, and then you can do real feasibility studies on them. Now, I'm going to put controls here because whether you are actually in a refurbishment situation or a new build situation, yes, you need data to manage, but you need control to manage the building. And without it, and they are really the Cinderella technology. They've always been kind of accepted they're there. The training alongside it hasn't been very good. A lot of the time the systems get turned off because they're not set up properly, but they really are your most powerful tool. And there's a new EN standard a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, it was written by techies, so it's almost unreadable, all 140 pages of it. I'm actually working with the industry at the moment to produce a 4-page shortened version so people actually can navigate the standard and get the salient points out of it. and that will be produced as a kind of white goods publication where BRE write it, but anybody else can take it, put their branding on and put it down their supply chain they wish. If you want to talk to me about that afterwards, you're quite welcome to. That's going to be out in the next few months. I'm also writing a buyer's guide for the Energy Managers Association as well about controls, because it classifies controls. Now, unfortunately, that looks a bit meaningless, so let's put it into context. Class D is where UK generally is. Class C is the level of the new building regulations as defined in the Non-Domestic Building Services Compliance Guide. Really rolls off the tongue, that, which is basically zonal controls. Class B, which is probably a good best practice, is basically a pre-programmable building energy management system. And the Rolls-Royce there at Class A is the fully programmable building energy management system. Not very sexy, except if you see the savings. Now, these are not my numbers, they're from the standard, and they are based on about 5,000 case studies over Europe, or about 1,500 the UK, because we had the biggest best practice programme, therefore we supplied the most data. And I'm going to look at offices for obvious reasons. Now, if you go to the normal portfolio, we baseline it on what's there normally. If we go up to the building regulations, we can save about 34%. Now, going to a 40% symposium, if we go to a pre-programmable BMS system, we can get 40% indicative savings. And if you want to go to the Rolls-Royce, and there may be several reasons for that, because you might want integration with fire systems, security, and other functionality of the building, which is fair enough, you can get up to 53% savings. And these are averages. So there is a real driver, and this should be the first technology off the shelf. I said it's been Cinderella before because people just accept they're there. However, if it's longevity of the building, you still have to do what I call online commissioning. You have to do this continuously and train people continuously and not let the knowledge go out of it. And FM companies really need to be, if you're going to use them rather than the other people in the portfolio, need to have properly trained staff to actually run these systems properly, to make them work properly and achieve the savings they can do. But you've got to remember the other factors. It's all about timing in this business. What I mean by that is what else is going on, because you want to piggyback on it. Because that leads to marginal costing, both at the design stage and the refurbishment stage, which is much easier to stop the specification breaking and the value engineering, inverted commas, which QSs do. My wife and I continue to argue, because she's with QS for one of the major companies in town, on the corner at St Paul's, and we argue about value engineering. To me, it's just cost cutting. And yes, it may reduce your capex, but you're going to pay with it with your running costs, especially in the first few years. Whilst if you actually do the marginal costing and invest at that point, as we've seen before, the savings are normally, and the payback is normally less than 3 years, let alone the ongoing savings for the lifetime of that building. So can you enhance the specification? And looking at that capex versus improved performance benefit. And the other benefits alongside that, because if this building is designed properly and run well, the maintenance will be reduced. And that's normally the same magnitude of the energy savings from my experience. I've done about 500-600 cases by now. And that can be easily quantified with the maintenance logs or the purchasing records of an organisation. Then there's increased productivity. Now, a lot has talked about this, however, it's very difficult to quantify it, and the evidence at best is sketchy out there. There's a reasonable amount of post-occupancy, but what it does provide is anecdotal evidence, really. It's the same order of magnitude as the other two, and it supports the case in that way. So really that's your kind of safety net. You do the other two, and you've got that bit of leeway there producing the business case, if the rest of the figures are correct. But the first barriers are really the funding of enabling measures. Who are you actually going to get to pay for the metering, running the benchmarking through, and getting those right resources in place to make this work? Well, let's be honest about it. Till we go to the bottom end, which is the investment scenario, the way to do that is just set it on what I can save on the bills. You wouldn't believe it or not, but when you look at your energy bills, in the UK, over half of them are incorrect. And you're normally getting overcharged, either for data charges, procurement charges, line charges, data charges, they're normally wrong. And there are organisations that make a big living out of doing that, but that's a potential saving that you can then put in the pot and then use for reinvestment on making the business case, because then you gain trust. You need to know the rules of the game. What is acceptable? Which stakeholders you've got to convince? Know the details of the usage and the state of the asset as well. And that means doing the investigation, going on site. And then there's a strategy plan we heard about. Without a way of actually implementing all this data and all the good things you're doing, it just stops there. You need an action plan carrying it forward. And you need to know how the projects are assessed on an organisational basis, because normally it's just mechanical. It goes in with the FD, puts it in a spreadsheet, and comes out the other end. So preparation of the case is very important. And keep it short and simple. I said, if I was in a business case now, I'd have lost you by now. It's too long. 1 page of A4 at most. Doesn't mean you've got to know all the data behind it, that's fine, but you've got to actually keep it short and sweet, and you've got to keep to what the benefits are and what they're going to gain out of it and what the investment, highlighting numbers. And present the options include, how do I manage my risk, the do nothing scenario, then at least 2 others. It's got to be unbiased and based on those benefits versus cost, and no personal preferences, because we've all got our own, but we've got to try and take that out of the equation. And what are the benefits? Well, we're talking about revenue generation here, increased productivity, cost control, importantly, resource efficiency, plus reduced consumption, waste minimisation, and then we're talking about trust now. And that's internal and external, enhancing the brand value. We've seen that earlier presenter. And then a positive culture within the people actually occupying it, so they will come back again. They're tenants of the future. And then there's the risk management, with the regulations and also the environmental incidents if applicable. And finally, the pitch. I said I would have lost you earlier because it's going to be simple. Know the audience, pick the appropriate media, and make it sharp and to the point. You have, when you're presenting to a business environment, normally about 1 minute to hook them, 2 minutes to land them, and then they listen to what else you've got to say. So hopefully I hooked you and landed you, and you've listened to the rest of it. And remember the punchline. This is about saving costs in the future and making your product or your assets actually sellable later on. You're looking to the future, not just the short-termism. And that's always been a problem with the UK market, where it's driven by the accountants and discounting rates. But now we have increasing energy prices, along with low discounting rates, you have the opportunity now to actually carry this forward. And success stories work wonderfully as well. We've seen the ones there, and they are good advertisements for this. Also, you need to know your stuff. Now, I'm going to leave it there because the chairman said he wants to have questions now, so I'll leave it on that slide. Thank you very much for your time. That's you, sir.